There's something I've always found genuinely comforting about The Walking Dead. And I don't mean the walkers or the violence or any of the grittier stuff. I mean the decisions, the choices people make. Because across 11 seasons of television, spanning something like 177 episodes, the survivors of this particular apocalypse made an absolutely breathtaking number of decisions that, on reflection, you would probably not recommend to anyone. And I find that deeply reassuring, in a way. Not because I want them to fail. I love these characters. I've spent more hours with Rick Grimes and Daryl Dixon and Carol and Michonne than I've spent with some actual people, I know. But there's something about the sheer consistency of the poor judgment, the way it spans seasons, communities, leadership changes, and geographical locations that feels almost like a warm blanket. These people are dealing with an incomprehensible situation, and they are doing their best, and their best is frequently quite something. Part of what makes it interesting, and this is the thing I keep coming back to, is that the mistakes are almost never stupid in a simple way. They're not the mistakes of people who aren't paying attention or don't care. They're the mistakes of people who are paying enormous attention, who care deeply, and who are making the best call they can with the information they have at the time, which is a particular kind of mistake. It's the kind you can see yourself making in the right circumstances, which is probably why it's so uncomfortable to watch. The Walking Dead ran from October 2010 to November 2022. 12 years. In that time, it went through 5 showrunners, a cultural peak that made it the most watched drama in cable television history, and a long gradual decline that ended with a finale watched by a fraction of its peak audience. The show's decisions, as a piece of television, mirror its characters' decisions in one important respect. They were sometimes brilliant, sometimes inexplicable, and almost always made with conviction. Tonight, we're only looking at the characters, the in-world choices, the decisions made by people who live in the apocalypse with apocalypse-level stakes, and whose track record of assessing situations accurately ranges from admirable to genuinely spectacular in its inaccuracy. One thing I'll say before we start, this isn't meant as a criticism of the show or the writers or the characters. If anything, it's the opposite. The reason these decisions are worth revisiting is that they were made by people whose lives, whose relationships, whose entire sense of what mattered had been upended so completely that any decision at all, was being made under conditions that most people never encounter. The context is always relevant. The apocalypse is a terrible environment for good judgment, and the characters of The Walking Dead managed, most of the time, to produce judgment that was merely flawed rather than catastrophic. That's actually quite impressive. The catastrophic ones are the ones we're here for, obviously, but still. So tonight, that's what we're doing. We're going to take a long, slow, fond walk through the full run of The Walking Dead, season by season, and just appreciate some of the choices. The ones that made you sit up a little straighter. The ones that made you say, no, don't do that at the screen, quietly, to yourself, probably past midnight. The ones that you think about years later and still can't entirely work out the logic of. There's no ranking here, and there's no urgency. This is not a countdown. We're just going to move through the show chronologically, spend some time with each era, and give the decision-making the kind of thoughtful, unhurried attention it deserves. Some of these are character mistakes in the truest sense, choices made under pressure, with bad information, by people who are scared and exhausted. Some of them are more in the category of, how did no one in that writer's room say, hang on? Both kinds are worth visiting. Before we get going, if you could take a moment to subscribe, it is completely free, and it genuinely helps this channel more than you know. Right, let's get into it. We're starting at the very beginning. A coma patient wakes up, the world has ended, and the decisions start almost immediately. The first thing worth understanding about Season 1 of The Walking Dead is how genuinely strange and lonely it felt. The show premiered in October 2010, and it had a quality that's hard to describe now, because we've seen so much post-apocalyptic television since. But at the time, it was remarkable. This quietness. The empty roads, the abandoned shopping trolleys. Rick Grimes cycling through a silent Georgia suburb in a hospital gown, passing overturned cars, and the soft, collapsed remains of things that used to mean something. It felt real in a way that the genre hadn't quite managed before. And then Rick makes his first significant mistake, and the season is off and running. The horse into Atlanta's the one. If you've seen the show, you remember it. Rick finds a horse in a paddock outside the city, saddles it up, and rides it into downtown Atlanta, a city that, based on everything he's seen in the past 12 hours, is thoroughly overrun with walkers. His reasoning seems to be that a horse is quiet and fast, which is true in a field. In a city, surrounded by thousands of undead people who are attracted to noise and movement, a horse is a large, panicking animal that can't turn around quickly and will absolutely scream. The horse does not make it. The horse gets pulled down by walkers almost immediately, and Rick barely escapes by hiding under it and then crawling into a tank, which brings us to the grenade. Rick finds a grenade in the tank on a dead soldier. He takes it, sensibly enough, you'd want a grenade, and he holds on to it for the entire first season. He carries it through the department store, through the sewer escape, through the camp at the quarry, through the drive to the CDC. And then in the season finale, when the CDC is about to explode and the doors are magnetically sealed, he uses it to blow open an exit, which works perfectly. I don't have a complaint about the grenade specifically. I just find something quietly funny about the image of Rick Grimes. For 6 episodes, having a live grenade in his pocket, and nobody really mentioning it. Now, the CDC going to the CDC as a destination was genuinely reasonable. Dr. Jenner might have answers. There might be resources. It was a plan with actual logic behind it. The problem is what happens when they get there. Jenner locks them in. He explains that the facility is going to self-destruct. He offers them the choice of dying in the blast rather than going back out into the world. And a remarkable number of the group sit down and genuinely consider it. Jackie decides to stay. Jenner himself stays. And there's a long sequence where several characters seem to be weighing the option of dying in an explosion versus continuing to try to live. I understand the emotional logic of that moment. The show earns it through everything that comes before. But from a practical standpoint, nobody in that group immediately walked to the nearest window and started looking for something to break it with. They find a way out eventually, through Rick's grenade, but the willingness to sit with the option of perhaps we just let this building blow up with us inside it is a particular flavour of apocalypse fatigue that the show introduces very early. And then there's the secret, the thing Jenna tells Rick privately in the finale, which Rick then carries for the better part of a season and a half. Jenna tells Rick that the virus, whatever it is already inside everyone. That dying means turning, regardless of whether you were bitten. That the bite just accelerates the process. This is information that changes everything about how a survivor group should handle death, should handle the dying, should handle the grief of watching someone go. It is arguably the single most important piece of information about the world any character in the show possesses at that point. Rick decides not to tell anyone. His reason, when he finally admits it in the season 2 finale, is that he didn't know if it was true. Which is understandable. Jenna was clearly not entirely stable by that point. But I wasn't sure if the information was accurate is a different thing from, therefore I'll say nothing to the people I'm responsible for, and we'll all just figure it out as we go. The secret sits there, quietly reshaping everything, while the group continues making decisions about safety and proximity and care for the dead that they might have made differently if they'd known. The thing about how the secret eventually comes out is worth a moment. When Rick finally tells the group, in the season 2 finale, on a country road at night, after the farm has burned and they're all exhausted and grieving, their reaction is fury. Laurie backs away from him. People shout. It's treated as a betrayal. which it is in a specific sense, but it's also the kind of betrayal that Rick justified to himself as protection, which is the category that most of his complicated decisions fall into. He wasn't hiding the information to benefit himself. He was hiding it because he'd decided, without asking, that the group was better off not carrying it. This paternalism, the decision to protect people from information that might hurt them, made without their consent or input, is a thread that runs through Rick's entire leadership across the show. Sometimes it works, often it doesn't. And it starts here with a CDIC scientist's whispered secret and a man who decided, driving away from a burning building, that knowing was too much of a burden to put on the people he loved. Here's a fun detail, or maybe not fun exactly, but interesting. Rick's reason for hiding the secret also functions as a kind of template for a pattern that runs through his leadership for most of the series. He knows something. He decides it's better for the group if he handles it alone. He sits with it for much longer than seems wise. This pattern does not tend to end well, and it starts here in the CDC car park with a secret that the group deserved to hear. But Season 1's mistakes are small, relatively speaking. Everyone was new to the end of the world. The group was still figuring out who they were to each other, what the rules were, how decisions got made. Season 2 is where the decision-making starts operating at full capacity. One small thing about the Atlanta escape that I've always found interesting. When Rick finally gets out of the tank, he does so with a group of strangers he's met in the previous 30 minutes, including a man called Daryl Dixon, who immediately tries to murder T-Dog and has to be handcuffed to a pipe on a rooftop. Rick makes the executive decision, having known these people for perhaps an hour, to handcuff Merle and leave him on the roof when the group has to evacuate. He leaves a hacksaw within reach. Merle saws through his own wrist to escape. This is the beginning of a character relationship that will last for 3 seasons. The point is less about whether Rick was wrong to handcuff Merle. Merle was actively endangering people, and more about how immediately and confidently Rick started making executive decisions about strangers from the first hour of his apocalypse. He woke up from a coma, found the world had ended, rode a horse into Atlanta, nearly died in a tank, and was immediately in charge of a group decision about whether to handcuff a racist to a roof. He took to this with remarkable calm. There's also the Morales situation, which is brief but quietly significant. Morales and his family were part of the original Atlanta camp. When the group decides to leave for the CDC, Morales tells Rick they're not coming. They have family in Birmingham, and they're going to try to find them. Rick gives him a gun and a map. They part ways with genuine warmth. Morales and his family walk into the show's off-screen Georgia and disappear for 6 entire seasons. He comes back in Season 8 as a saviour, having joined Negan's organisation somewhere in the intervening years. He's killed by Daryl almost immediately after his reappearance, before the show can do much with his return. His story, the 6 seasons of what happened to him, exists entirely in a gap the show never fills. I mention this not as a mistake exactly, more as a reminder that the show's world is full of people making decisions in the background that the audience never sees. Morales looked at the options in front of him and chose Birmingham over the CDC. That choice led somewhere. We just don't know where. Season 2's structure is unusual for a show of this kind, because it essentially commits half its run to a single ongoing situation, the disappearance of Carol's daughter Sophia, that doesn't resolve until a scene so devastating and quiet that most people who watched it have never quite forgotten it. The Search is emotionally rich television. It's also built on a foundation of decisions that, examined calmly, are a little difficult to defend. It starts on the highway. The group hits a traffic jam of abandoned cars and stops to scavenge. A Walker herd comes through. Everyone hides. Sophia comes out from under a car too early, gets spotted by 2 stragglers, and runs into the woods. Rick goes after her, and here's the decision. Rick catches up with Sophia, manages to lead the 2 walkers away from her, kills them both, and then goes back to where he left her. She's gone. The instruction he gave her, and this is worth sitting with, was to wait by a creek bed, and if he didn't come back, to run toward the highway and look for the cars. He was asking a 12-year-old who had just been chased through the woods by two people who were trying to eat her to navigate back to a specific road by herself in an unfamiliar area, while he went in the other direction to deal with the walkers. She didn't wait. She ran. The show never quite blames Rick for the initial instruction, and the show is right not to. He was working fast, under pressure, with limited options, but watching it back, there's something genuinely poignant about the gap between what Rick asked of Sophia and what a 12-year-old could reasonably be expected to do in that moment. What follows is the part that becomes its own category of decision-making error. The group spends approximately the next 7 episodes searching for Sophia. They search the woods, they search the creek bed, they search the farms and the fields and the surrounding area. Daryl, who is an expert tracker, follows her trail and finds her doll. He nearly kills himself on the search and has a remarkable hallucination involving Merle. The effort is genuine and sustained. Sophia was in Herschel's barn. She had apparently wandered to the farm, been found by Herschel's people in a walker state, and been put in the barn with the others. Nobody told the group. Herschel assumed they'd be leaving soon. The group searched everything else. Nobody, in 7 episodes of an active search, knocked on the barn and said, "Has anyone looked in there?" To be clear, Herschel's family knew. They knew the group was looking for a little girl. They knew there was a child-sized walker in the barn. The communication failure here runs in multiple directions, and the show handles that. Herschel's belief that the walkers are sick people who can be helped is presented with genuine sympathy. But the image of the group standing in the yard of a farm, conducting a grid search of the surrounding countryside, while Sophia is 30 meters away in a locked barn, is one of those things that The Walking Dead never entirely resolves into comfort. Now, while all of this is going on, there are a few parallel decisions happening that are also worth spending a moment on. Laurie discovers she's pregnant. This is the kind of news that requires careful handling in an apocalypse, and Laurie's initial instinct is to quietly obtain morning after pills from the pharmacy on a supply run and take them without telling Rick. Glenn is the one who brings them to her, along with a packet of prenatal vitamins, and he gives her both, which is a quietly lovely detail. Laurie takes the morning after pills, and then immediately sticks her fingers down her throat. Rick finds out anyway, because the empty packet is in the tent, so the pill taking achieves very little practically, while adding significant emotional damage, because Rick finding out about the pregnancy through a discarded medication wrapper is not ideal. Before that though, Laurie does something that doesn't get discussed as often as it probably should. She gets a message that Rick might be in danger, gets into a car by herself, drives down a rural 2-lane road in the dark while looking at a handwritten map, and crashes. A walker comes through the windscreen. She escapes. Shane and Glenn find her. She returns to the farm. The whole sequence takes about 20 minutes of screen time and has essentially no effect on the plot. Rick was fine. The danger message was a miscommunication. But it does establish that Laurie has a tendency to act alone, immediately, on incomplete information, which is a character trait that will matter more as the show continues. And then there's Carl. Season 2. Carl is an extraordinary case study in a child who exists, as far as the narrative is concerned, specifically to be in the wrong place at the wrong moment. He wanders off to a creek and almost gets bitten by a walker stuck in the mud. He wanders away from the adults at the farm repeatedly. He takes knives from a dead man's truck and brings them to Shane. He goes to talk to the walker in the mud, the one stuck in the mud, by himself, multiple times because he finds it interesting. At one point he throws rocks at it. The group's approach to Carl in Season 2 is essentially to tell him to stay where he is and trust that he will do that. He does not do that. Nobody is specifically assigned to watch him. There's no buddy system. He is the son of the group's leader, and he wanders around an active apocalypse unsupervised with something approaching routine. This is not a criticism of Carl as a character. He's a kid, kids do this, and the show uses it to build toward his development into a genuinely capable person later. But the number of times someone in the group says, "Where's Carl?" and has to go find him in season 2 is, if you were keeping count, somewhat elevated. The barn reveal comes at the end of the mid-season finale. It's one of the show's great scenes. And then season 2's second half gets complicated in entirely different ways. But before we leave the first half, there are a few more things worth a moment. Dale's role in the group during the farm is interesting because Dale is often right and almost never listened to. He sees Shane's deterioration clearly and says so. He picks up on the Herschel barn situation before almost anyone. He advocates for Randall's life in a way that costs him his own. And he consistently makes his arguments in a register that the group finds easy to dismiss. He's elderly, he's idealistic, he comes from a place of moral conviction rather than tactical reasoning. The group's relationship with Dale is a case study in how a group in crisis responds to someone who is consistently correct but persistently inconvenient. There's also a moment midway through the Sophia search that I think about more than it probably warrants. Shane, who has been increasingly unhinged, announces to Laurie that he's leaving. He tells her he can't stay in the group, can't watch Rick lead them, can't be around her and Carl. She tells him she thinks he should go. He overhears this. He stays anyway, and then he uses staying for Laurie and Carl as the justification for everything he does in the second half of the season, despite Laurie having told him to leave. The self-narration Shane does, the story he tells himself about why he's doing what he's doing, is one of the show's better pieces of character work in those early seasons. He's not wrong that the group faces serious dangers. He's not wrong that Rick's approach has costs. He is, however, deeply wrong about the solution and about his own role in it. The gap between his self-image and his actual behaviour widens across the season until it becomes too large to bridge, and Rick closes the gap in the woods. And one more thing about the Sophia search, Rick's grid. He draws a search grid on a map and works through it methodically, expanding outward from the creek. It's the right approach. It's what you'd do. The grid, executed faithfully, should have led them to the barn eventually. The question is whether anyone would have recognised what was inside before they opened it, and whether that would have changed anything at all. The second half of season 2 is really about two things running in parallel that nobody in the group wants to address directly. The walkers in Herschel's barn and Shane. Both situations are visible, both situations are deteriorating, and both situations get worse specifically because everyone around them decides that the best approach is to wait and see. Let's start with the barn. After the barn reveal, Herschel leaves the farm. He's devastated, watching Rick shoot the walker that was his stepdaughter Sophia in front of everyone was not part of his understanding of what the group would do on his property. He turns up at a bar in town, drinking. Rick and Glenn find him. They're in the process of convincing him to come back when two living strangers come into the bar. This encounter goes sideways, both strangers die, and one of them had friends waiting outside. The group barely escapes. The thing about the barn, before all of that, is that everyone in the group knew about it, and nobody told Herschel that they knew. Glenn found out and told Maggie, and the two of them sat on the information for what felt like days. Dale found out and sat on it too. Shane eventually found out, decided unilaterally to open the barn and shoot all the walkers, and did it without discussing the plan with anyone. The group's response was to mostly join in. It was chaos that could have been a conversation. To give Shane his due for a moment, his frustration with the barn situation was completely rational. Keeping walkers in a structure that was not designed to hold them, that the group walked past every day, that could fail at any moment, was a genuine safety risk. His method of addressing it was characteristically Shane, explosive, unilateral, and with no apparent consideration of how Herschel would react, what the consequences would be, or what happened to Carol when Sophia walked out. Right diagnosis rather difficult execution. But then, Shane's entire arc in Season 2 is essentially this same pattern at escalating scale. He's right about the problems and absolutely disastrous in how he responds to them. He's right that the farm is not a permanent solution. He's right that Rick's attachment to hope is sometimes making the group less safe. He's right that the group needs to be harder, faster, more decisive. He is also, by the middle of Season 2, pointing a gun at Rick's back in the woods, killing Otis and leaving him to be eaten by walkers to save himself during a supply run, and becoming so obviously destabilized that the group's passive response to all of it is remarkable. Dale sees it. Dale consistently sees it. He has the long, uncomfortable conversation with Shane about Otis and about Rick. He hides all the guns, which is worth spending a moment on. Dale's reasoning, when he takes the group's weapons and hides them in the swamp, is that Shane is dangerous, and that removing the weapons removes the immediate risk. This is not a bad instinct, but Dale executes it alone, tells nobody, and then when the farm is overrun by walkers, and everyone needs to fight their way out, he has to quickly explain where all the ammunition is, in the middle of the chaos. The impulse to reduce a dangerous person's access to weapons is reasonable. The method of doing it by yourself, without telling anyone, and then hoping nothing happens before you can stage a proper intervention, that's the part that leaves something to be desired. And then there's a conversation that tends to get overlooked, which is the one between Carol and Daryl toward the end of the season. Carol tells Daryl that Shane is dangerous, that Rick needs to be careful, that something needs to happen. Daryl essentially agrees, processes it with characteristic Daryl brevity, and then the group continues doing nothing collectively. The show is quite honest about how long the group waits. Rick eventually kills Shane because Shane leads him into the woods and tries to kill him. It takes that for the situation to be resolved. Shane, before he dies, tells Rick something worth noting. He says that Rick can't survive in the new world, that he's too decent, that the people who will make it are the ones who are willing to do what's necessary. Rick's response is immediate and decisive. He stabs Shane, and then of course Shane reanimates, which confirms Jenna's secret, and Carl has to shoot him, which is devastating in a particular way, because Carl shooting his father's best friend is one of the moments that starts the process of turning Carl into who he later becomes. The season ends with the farm overrun, the group scatters, and there's a moment, driving away, where Rick finally tells everyone what Jenna said. The group is furious. He kept it from them for most of 2 seasons. His answer, that he wasn't sure it was true, and that it wouldn't have changed anything, is the kind of answer that you can understand and also find genuinely insufficient at the same time. One quick thing before we move on, and this one is just a detail I've always found interesting. After the barn is cleared and the group is burying the dead, there's a small scene where Glenn is clearly falling for Maggie and is desperately trying to be smooth about it. He asks her to meet him in the hayloft. He writes a note in the middle of a silent, grieving dinner in a room full of people. It's rather sweet. It's also the kind of romantic declaration that requires you to be in a barn that you know is full of walkers, which Glenn apparently forgot about in the moment. No notes, really? He was trying his best. Season 3 is where the setting changes entirely. The prison, the governor, and one of the most sustained strings of questionable decisions any single character makes across the show's run. Actually, one more thing from the farm before we leave it. The Randall situation. Randall is a young man the group encounters at the end of Season 2. He was with a larger group of survivors and fell off a platform and impaled his leg. Rick's group saves him, then realizes that his group is dangerous and they can't let him go back. They can't keep him indefinitely. They spend several episodes debating what to do with him. The options on the table are kill him, keep him prisoner, release him blindfolded, and hope for the best. A vote is held. Shane pushes for execution. Herschel doesn't want to be responsible for it. Rick delays. Dale makes an impassioned argument for Randall's life, the one that costs him his own, because he's killed by a walker while making a solo night walk shortly afterward. The group eventually decides to exile Randall, blindfolded on a road somewhere. This plan never gets executed because Shane kills Randall first, in the barn, and then Rick kills Shane in the woods. What the Randall situation reveals is that the group didn't have a framework for dealing with threatening strangers who weren't immediately violent. They had guns. They could shoot walkers. A person who was potentially dangerous but not actively threatening. They had no agreed upon protocol, and the absence of one nearly tore them apart. This is a gap that comes up repeatedly. Each new community, each new stranger, each person who might be an ally or might be a threat gets handled through improvisation, rather than anything approaching a consistent policy. Sometimes improvisation is the right call, but the recurring crises it creates suggest that a conversation at some farm dinner table, before things got acute, might have been useful. T-Dog is another figure from this period worth mentioning briefly, if only because he's a person whose decisions the show largely doesn't examine, because the show doesn't give him quite enough screen time to have distinct ones. He's reliable. He does what's asked of him. He dies in season 3 protecting Carol from walkers, which is a heroic death that the show honours, but also happens in an episode that's doing several other things simultaneously. T-Dog deserved more episodes than he got. This is less a character mistake and more a production one, but it's in the same category as Carol and Daryl getting significantly more screen time because the writers knew what to do with them, and T-Dog not getting that attention because they didn't. Some characters get room to make interesting decisions, some don't get the room. Season 3 opens in a way that suggests the group has been fundamentally changed by everything that happened at the farm. They're leaner, more capable, quieter. There's a scene in the first few minutes where the group clears a house, moves through it silently, communicates entirely through gestures. It's one of the best things the show ever did. This image of a group that has learned finally to work together without words. Rick's planning the prison assault. Herschel's leg gets amputated with a hatchet in one of the more startling scenes of the season. Things feel purposeful. And then Laurie dies in childbirth, and Rick stops functioning. The breakdown itself is one of Andrew Lincoln's best performances. The grief is real, and it's handled with genuine care. Rick hears phantom phone calls from dead people. He sees Laurie standing in the prison yard in a white wedding dress. He charges through the prison with a machete, screaming. He refuses to engage with the group's decisions for several episodes. He goes outside the fence alone to look for visions of his dead wife. None of this is wrong as grief. The problem is the timing. While Rick is processing, the prison has a real and immediate threat. The governor exists. Tyrese and his group arrive at the prison doors, clearly decent people with skills and numbers, requesting shelter. And Rick, in the middle of a hallucination, screams at them to leave. He waves a gun at the air. Everyone in the room watches their leader have what looks, from the outside, like a complete break with reality. Tyrese's group is sent away. They end up at Woodbury. This matters enormously later, but the group doesn't know that yet. They know that Rick just turned away potential allies because of a vision of his dead wife on a catwalk. Nobody effectively fills the leadership gap for quite some time. Herschel is recovering from losing his leg. Daryl is managing the day-to-day. Glenn is holding things together. But the structural hole left by Rick's absence is significant, and the show doesn't entirely engage with what it cost them. The delayed alliance with Tyrese, the vulnerability it created. Rick eventually comes back more or less. He starts being present again. But the episode where Carl quietly tells him he should stop being the leader, that he deserves a rest and that Herschel and Daryl should handle things. Carl says this with a flatness that's extraordinary for a child, is one of the sadder moments of the season. Because Carl is right, and Rick knows he's right, and neither of them quite knows what to do about that. Now, Andrea. Andrea's season 3 arc is the one that tends to generate the most discussion when you talk to people about The Walking Dead, And I think that's because it's the rare case where the show's decision-making and a character's decision-making are both genuinely hard to account for. Andrea is one of the group's original survivors. She's capable, she's thoughtful, she has better shooting instincts than almost anyone in the original group. And then she gets to Woodbury, meets the governor, and makes a series of decisions that lead, step by step, to her dying in a torture chamber 40 feet from safety, while the people she loves watch. She and Michonne arrive at Woodbury after a season of surviving on their own. The community is clean, organised, apparently functional. There are children playing. There's food. Andrea is exhausted and injured, and she sees something that looks like civilization, and she wants it to be real. That's the beginning of the logic, and it's completely human. Michonne doesn't trust it. Michonne's instincts about the governor are correct from almost the first scene she shares with him. She sees the aquarium full of heads. She watches him respond to questions with a very particular kind of calm that suggests something underneath it. She wants to leave. Andrea wants to stay. Michonne says she'll wait, but she won't stay long. Andrea keeps finding reasons for both of them to stay a little longer. When Michonne finally leaves alone, Andrea watches her go. The governor, by this point, has done the following: massacred a National Guard convoy, lied to the entire community about what happened, kept his reanimated daughter in a cage, and maintained a torture room in his base of operations. Andrea doesn't know all of this yet, but Michonne does, and Andrea has chosen to dismiss Michonne's concerns because she wants the thing Woodbury is offering to be genuine. And then comes the scene in the episode Prey that I think about more than almost any other scene in the series. Carol tells Andrea to go back to Woodbury, sleep with the governor, and kill him while he's asleep. This is a cold and practical plan. Andrea goes back to Woodbury. She gets into bed with the governor. She picks up a knife. She's standing over him in the dark. The knife is in her hand. He's asleep, and she doesn't do it. She puts the knife down and lies back down. The show doesn't entirely explain this. There's something about Andrea that still believes the situation can be resolved peacefully, that she can somehow broker a truce, that violence is avoidable. This is not stupid. It's a real way that people think, particularly people who have seen a lot of violence and have a deep aversion to causing more. But the governor is planning to kill her friends. She knows this. She's been told directly. She's standing over him with a knife. She puts the knife down. And then later, this is the part that makes the whole arc genuinely agonizing. She actually escapes. She runs. He chases her in his truck through the countryside. She makes it into a warehouse, loses him in a room full of walkers, reaches the door, and sees the prison through the fence. She can see it. She's waving. Rick is at the guard tower. He's looking at her through the scope. The governor tackles her from behind and covers her mouth before Rick can react. There's no mistake here on Andrea's part in those final moments. She ran as fast as she could. She made it as far as she could. She almost made it. The bad luck of the tackle is not a decision. It's just the moment the show decided to end her story. But it sits on top of the long accumulated weight of every decision that led to her being in that position, in that car park, trying to wave at a prison through a fence. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The governor, meanwhile, is making his own set of decisions. And those decisions have their own particular quality. Before we get to the governor's decision-making, one thing about Michonne's role in the Woodbury arc deserves more space than it usually gets. Michonne is right about everything from the beginning. She's right about the governor's hostility. She's right about the walker heads. She's right that leaving is the only safe option. She's right that returning to Woodbury after escaping was unnecessary, and nobody listens to her. The group treats her with suspicion for most of the early season 3 episodes, because she arrived as a stranger and because her communication style is not designed to make people comfortable. She says very little. She gives away almost nothing about herself. She carries her katana and her judgment, and she deploys both sparingly. The group's difficulty with Michonne in Season 3 is a case study in how a group already struggling with trust processes a new person who refuses to perform trustworthiness in legible ways. She doesn't explain herself. She doesn't build relationships through conversation. She just keeps being right, while everyone around her takes longer to arrive at the same conclusions. This dynamic runs through several seasons, actually. Michonne is consistently the character who reads a situation most accurately and most quickly, and she's also consistently the character who the other characters take longest to fully trust. The two things are not unrelated. She sees things quickly because she's not invested in the comfortable interpretation, and people who aren't invested in the comfortable interpretation tend to make other people uncomfortable. The Merle situation in Season 3 also deserves a mention, because Merle's return is handled in a way that creates genuine complications the group doesn't fully address. He shows up at the prison after Woodbury falls, having been told to kill Michonne and failing to do it. The group's response to having Merle in their space is divided. Glenn wants him out, Daryl wants him in, Rick is uncertain. Herschel, who has less reason than anyone to be generous, sits with Merle in his cell and finds common ground through their shared experience of significant amputation and the Bible. The show earns this moment. Merle eventually acts independently. He goes to deliver Michonne to the governor on his own, then changes his mind, then tries to kill the governor himself in an ambush that doesn't work. He's killed by the governor. Daryl finds him reanimated. This is one of the show's better deaths, earned through a season of watching Merle perform loyalty to the wrong people, and then, at the end, make a choice that the show treats as redemption. Whether the group could have used Merle better, given him a clearer role, a defined set of responsibilities, some form of monitored integration, is a question the show doesn't really explore. He's kept at a kind of uncertain distance right up until he makes his independent move. The group's handling of genuinely difficult people, people who are useful but dangerous, capable but unpredictable, is one of the recurring management challenges that the show returns to without ever quite resolving. The governor is an interesting villain specifically because he's not irrational. Philip Blake, that's his actual name, which the show uses sparingly, is intelligent, organised, and in his own way, a very effective leader. He's kept Woodbury running, he's maintained community morale, his cruelty is purposeful rather than chaotic. And this is what makes his decisions interesting when you examine them, because they tend to make internal sense until suddenly they don't. The negotiation meeting is the one that takes the most thinking about. Rick and the governor meet in an abandoned feedlot building to talk. The meeting is brokered by a third party. Both sides show up with weapons and backup. The governor offers terms, hand over Michonne, and the prison group can stay unmolested in their territory. He presents this as a genuine offer. Rick takes it seriously, not just as a tactical exercise, genuinely seriously. Herschel is there, and Herschel engages with the question of whether the offer might be real, whether there's a version of this where two communities can coexist. This is, to be fair, the kind of hope that Season 3 has been building in the character. Herschel's faith, his ability to believe in possibilities that harder people have closed off. But the group knows at this point what the governor did to Maggie and Glenn. They know about the heads. They know Merle tried to kill Michonne on the governor's orders. They know about the arena fights, the idea that a man who keeps a room full of severed heads in fish tanks as a hobby is going to honour a peace deal, requires a particular kind of optimism that, on reflection, feels out of scale with what the evidence supports. Rick tells the group he's considering it. He tells Herschel he's hoping Herschel will talk him out of it. The whole thing has a quality of, I know this is wrong, but I want someone else to say it, that is very human and also slightly maddening from the outside. Here's a fun detail about the negotiation. The governor doesn't actually want the deal. He never did. His plan was always to take the prison regardless. The meeting was partly psychological, partly information gathering. Rick sensing this on some level, and still spending 2 episodes agonising over the offer, is one of the more interesting character wobbles of the season. Meanwhile, In the torture room that Milton built, Andrea is tied to a dental chair. Milton, who tried to help her escape and was killed for it by the governor, is reanimating in the corner of the room. He told Andrea before he died that he'd left a pair of pliers by her feet. She spends a long, tense sequence trying to pick the pliers up with her toes, cut through her bonds, and deal with Milton before he reaches her. She does it. She cuts herself free. There are sounds of a struggle behind the door, and then silence. The thing about Andrea's death that makes it particularly difficult to sit with. She almost entirely resolved the situation herself. She found the pliers, she cut the bonds, she fought off a reanimated Milton. She was free. The show places her death a single step past her rescue of herself, which is a particular kind of cruelty in the storytelling. Now, the season finale. The governor leads his forces to the prison for the assault. The assault goes terribly. The group, Rick's group, has rigged the prison with smoke grenades and the alarm system, and they spook the Woodbury fighters into retreating. The entire army runs away. This is where the finale gets strange. The governor stops the retreating convoy on a country road. He screams at the Woodbury people. They refuse to go back. And then the governor opens fire on his own people. He shoots them in the road. He kills nearly all of them. Martinez and Shumpert watch and do nothing. The dramatic logic of this is coherent. It's the moment the governor fully reveals himself as a monster rather than just a dangerous leader. But the practical logic is interesting. He has just destroyed his own army. He has 2 remaining loyal followers. His town has seen what he's capable of. He drives away with nowhere to go and nothing to show for it, having just murdered the people who trusted him. What was the plan after this? The show picks up with him as a drifter in season 4, which answers the question, but there's a version of those final moments that the season never quite addresses. The governor won the argument. He did what he wanted to do. And the result was that he ended up alone on a country road with 2 people and no future. Carl shoots a surrendering boy in the finale, and this is worth a moment. A Woodbury teenager is trying to give up. He's dropping his gun and putting his hands up. Carl shoots him, and then Carl, in a conversation with Rick afterward, explains his reasoning with a coldness that is remarkable for a 12-year-old. He lists the deaths that resulted from Rick's mercy, Dale, Laurie, Merle, and says he couldn't take the risk. The show doesn't fully endorse Carl's position, and it doesn't fully condemn it either. Herschel, who was there, tells Rick that the boy had surrendered. Carl insists on the arithmetic of survival. Both things are true. The moment is one of the sharpest in the season because it shows a child who has been taught mostly by circumstance to make calculations that should probably not be made by children. And then season 4 begins, several months later, with the prison looking like a real community. Gardens, a council, a school, children running around. It lasts until a flu breaks out, and then the decision-making moves into a new phase. One more piece of the season, 3 finale, worth a moment. What happens to the surviving Woodbury residents after the governor kills most of his own army? Karen survives the massacre by hiding under bodies. Rick finds her. She tells Tyrese to stand down, and then Rick does something he's been reluctant to do since the season began. He opens the prison to the Woodbury survivors. Older people, mostly. Non-fighters. People who had been living under the governor's protection for long enough that they'd never fully understood what he was. The decision to bring the Woodbury survivors into the prison, after a season of Rick refusing to take in strangers, after the chaos of Tyrese's arrival, is handled almost as an afterthought in the finale. It happens quickly, in a few quiet shots, and then the season ends. But it's a significant shift, and the people who join the prison community become the fabric of the world we see in the season 4 opening. Normal people trying to maintain something normal in a dangerous world, children studying, older residents gardening. This is what the show was always really about, underneath the walkers and the villains. What does community mean when the structures that used to hold it together are gone? What do you owe strangers? What do you risk for someone you don't know yet? The governor's answer to these questions was always self-serving. Rick's answer kept changing. The prison community's answer, in its best moments, was generous in a way that felt genuinely earned. The governor himself, meanwhile, disappears. The show picks him up again in season 4 with an entirely different identity, calling himself Brian, travelling with a new family, rebuilding a version of himself that he can live inside. The arc of his season 4 reappearance is genuinely one of the better things the show did with a villain. David Morrissey plays the vulnerability and the regression with real skill. You understand, watching it, how a person becomes the governor, not through a single catastrophic choice, but through a long series of smaller ones, each of which made sense in the moment. And then he raises another army, attacks the prison anyway, and dies on Michonne's sword. The regression is complete. Season 4 has 2 distinct halves, and they each have their own category of decision. The first half is about the flu, a serious respiratory illness spreading through the prison population, and the particular problems that arise when a community tries to manage a medical crisis with the resources available in an apocalypse. The second half is about the group being scattered and then following signs to a place called Terminus, which advertises itself as a sanctuary, without doing any meaningful advance investigation. Let's start with the flu. A virus starts moving through the prison. People become feverish, cough blood, and die quickly, usually reanimating before anyone can stop them. The council, Carol, Daryl, Glenn, Michonne, and Herschel, decides to quarantine the sick in a separate cell block. This is a reasonable call. Separating the infected from the healthy is basic epidemic management. What's harder to explain is what happens inside the quarantine. Dr. S, the prison's doctor, is among the sick. He's treating other patients from his sickbed. At one point he coughs directly onto Herschel's face. Blood, not just air. And Herschel is not wearing any face protection at the time. He's been wearing a bandana over his mouth while treating people, but when the blood hits his face and covers his eyes, he takes the bandana off and wipes his face with it. He then continues treating patients. The show is clear that Herschel understands how the flu spreads. He explains it to other people. He knows he's been potentially exposed, and he keeps treating patients without escalating the protective measures in any way. This is not a criticism of Herschel as a character. He stays in the quarantine zone because he believes it's the right thing to do, and the show earns that choice for him emotionally. But from a pure infection control standpoint, the moment the blood went on his face was the moment the exposure protocol needed to be reconsidered, and it wasn't. Meanwhile, Carol has been doing something that the group doesn't know about. When Karen and David show early symptoms of the flu, Carol kills them both and burns their bodies in the courtyard. Her reasoning is straightforward. They're infected, other people will get sick from them. Eliminating the source prevents the spread. It's a brutal utilitarian calculation, and Carol makes it alone, without discussing it with anyone. Rick figures it out. He goes through the quarantine area, finds evidence, and confronts Carol directly. She says yes, she did it. Simple as that. Rick then drives her out of the prison and tells her she can't come back. The decision to exile Carol is one of the more contested judgment calls Rick makes in the series. His reasoning is that Tyrese would kill her if he found out. Tyrese was in a relationship with Karen, and that Carol is a danger to the group's stability if she stays. This is probably correct on both counts, but exiling Carol also removes the group's most competent practical member, the person who has been running the survival training for children, the person Daryl trusts most. The group lost a significant amount of functional capacity when Carol left, and the show is fairly honest about that cost over the following season. Now, Bob Stuckey. Bob is a recovering alcoholic who joins the group in season 4 and is dealing with the weight of having been the sole survivor of 2 previous groups. He has depth, he's handled with care by the show, and then he goes on a supply run to a veterinary school to find flu medication and the supply run goes to a flooded basement full of walkers, and they barely make it out with the supplies. As they're escaping across a submerged shelf, with walkers pulling at them from below, Bob's bag gets caught and he nearly falls into the herd trying to hold on to it. Daryl has to help pull him up. Everyone makes it out, but it's extremely close. The bag had 1 bottle of alcohol in it. Bob is a recovering alcoholic who grabbed a bottle of liquor from the pharmacy section of a veterinary school during a flu medication supply run, nearly fell into a herd of submerged walkers to protect the bottle, and then was gently confronted about it by Daryl and didn't deny it. I find this sequence genuinely touching in a strange way. The addiction logic of it is real, and the show treats it seriously, but it's also a man who almost died and nearly got his colleagues killed to protect a bottle of liquor during a medical crisis. The show has the decency not to pretend this wasn't what it was. The second half of Season 4 splinters the group after the governor's attack destroys the prison. Everyone scatters, and then from multiple starting points, characters start following signs on the train tracks to a place called Terminus. The signs say, "Sanctuary for all, community for all, those who arrive, survive." They look handmade. There is no other information. Nobody has verified what Terminus actually is, who runs it, or what community for all means in practice. Multiple characters follow the signs across multiple episodes and converge on the same destination. When they arrive, it looks plausible. Clean. A woman named Mary is cooking over a grill. People are welcoming. The compound has walls and resources. And then Rick notices, walking through the compound, that people are wearing things. Glenn's pocket watch, which belonged to Herschel, a riot gear vest from the prison, a poncho that belonged to Daryl. These are things that belong to people Rick knows. The people of Terminus are wearing them. The group is already inside the compound. By the time Rick processes this, they're captured almost immediately. Here's a fun detail, or not fun, but there are signs as you approach Terminus on the train tracks that something is wrong. The show plants them. Bones, a cleared field. The particular quality of welcome that is too smooth, too practiced. Some of the group picks up on it. Daryl is uneasy. Rick is uneasy. They go in anyway, because what else do you do when you've been walking through Georgia for weeks? No, with no other destination. But the absence of any advance reconnaissance, any attempt to observe the settlement before entering it, any plan for if things went wrong, is representative of a recurring pattern in the way the group approaches new communities throughout the show. They need shelter. They need resources. The alternative to trusting a new settlement is continued uncertainty. And so, repeatedly, they trust. Sometimes they're right. Sometimes they find themselves in a cattle pen waiting to be slaughtered by cannibals. Season 5 picks up at Terminus. The escape is one of the show's best set pieces. And then the season moves to a hospital in Atlanta where Beth has been taken and where the decision-making enters a new phase. A few more things about the post-prison second half of Season 4 that are worth spending a moment on. The group's separate arcs, each splinter group making their own way toward Terminus, are interesting because they're each dealing with loss in different ways and each making different decisions as a result. Rick's group has Michonne, Carl, and then the three of them encounter Joe and the Claimers, a feral group of survivalists who have been tracking Rick since the prison. Rick kills Joe with his teeth. He bites through Joe's throat during a struggle, where Joe is about to shoot Carl. This is presented as a pivotal moment. Rick crossing a line he hadn't crossed before, doing something he couldn't have done at the beginning of the series. What's interesting is what Rick says afterward to Michonne. "I know what kind of man I am now." He means this as resolution, as clarity. The show supports this reading. But from the outside, what Rick has arrived at is comfort, with extreme violence as a first resort. And the show's endorsement of this position, delivered through Andrew Lincoln's performance, tends to make audiences read it as growth, without entirely interrogating whether it is. The Beth and Daryl arc in the second half of Season 4 is also worth mentioning, if only because it represents the show doing something it rarely did. slowing down to just 2 characters for most of an episode. They burn down a house together, they drink moonshine, they play a game where they have to say something true about themselves before drinking. The game unravels both of them in ways that feel earned by everything the season has put them through. Beth is captured by a car with a white cross on it at the end of the episode. The show doesn't explain this for quite a long time. The white cross cars are from Grady Memorial, the hospital. Beth disappears into their system, and that's where she stays until season 5. Also worth a note, Abraham, Rosita, and Eugene's group crosses paths with Glenn and Tara on the way to Terminus, and Abraham's decision to join the journey to the prison rather than continue to Washington is presented as a significant sacrifice. He wants to complete the mission. The mission that Eugene has told him is humanity's only hope. He delays it to help Glenn find Maggie. The delay costs nothing ultimately, since Eugene's mission was fictional, but Abraham doesn't know that when he makes the choice. As decisions go, it's one of the more quietly generous ones in a season full of people operating in survival mode. These scattered group arcs before Terminus are the show at its most intimate. Small groups, big skies, long roads. Whatever happens after Terminus, this is the show's most emotionally careful stretch of storytelling. The Grady Memorial Hospital arc is one of the stranger detours in the show's middle period, partly because it introduces an entirely new community with its own internal politics, partly because its resolution is so abrupt, and partly because of what happens with Beth at the end of it. Let's start with the hospital itself. The surviving officers of a collapsed Atlanta Police Department have set up a working community inside Grady Memorial. They rescue injured people, put them to work to pay off their debt, and maintain order through a hierarchy that has some uncomfortable overtones. Dawn, the commanding officer, is running a machine she's not entirely comfortable with, but can't see a way to dismantle. It's a genuinely interesting setting, more morally ambiguous than most of the show's communities. Beth has been held there since the end of season 4. She's been paying her debt, working, and carefully, methodically, learning how the system works and where its weak points are. She's been hiding a pair of scissors in her wrist wrap for days. She's been planning. The exchange plan Rick comes up with is clean and well executed. His group captures 2 of Dawn's officers. They propose a straightforward trade. 2 officers for Beth and Carol, who is also being held at the hospital. The exchange happens. Beth is released. Carol is released. The deal is done. Everyone is walking out. And then Dawn changes the terms. Dawn says she wants Noah back. Noah had been held at the hospital previously and had escaped with Beth. Dawn frames this as a matter of institutional principle. Officers died protecting Noah. She can't just let that investment walk away. It's a last-minute power play, and it's also probably a test of how the exchange will hold under pressure. Rick objects. Noah volunteers to stay. Beth hugs him goodbye. Dawn says, "I knew you'd be back." And Beth, who has survived the hospital through patience, through careful observation, through a kind of quiet, strategic intelligence the show has been building for half a season, says, "I get it now," walks up to Dawn and stabs her in the shoulder with the scissors. Dawn's reflexive response is to fire. Beth dies. The show frames this as a statement. Beth has decided that some forms of corruption can't be negotiated with, that the only honest response to "I knew you'd be back" is an act of refusal, and on those terms it lands with force. But Beth had the scissors for days. She had been planning an escape for most of her time at the hospital. She was 12 feet from the door. The exchange was complete, and she chose to make a point in the worst possible moment, in the worst possible way, to a woman holding a loaded gun. I don't know what the right reading of Beth's death is. The show clearly intends it as a moment of defiance, not a mistake. But the practical outcome is that one of the group's youngest and most recently capable members died to make a point to a woman who died 4 seconds later anyway, when Daryl shot Dawn in retaliation. The point was made. Beth didn't survive to see it made. The group is devastated. They walk out of the hospital. Daryl is carrying Beth's body, Maggie collapses. It's one of the sadder visual moments of the series. Now, Father Gabriel Stokes is introduced in Season 5 as the priest of a small church outside Terminus, and his backstory is revealed slowly. When the apocalypse came, he locked himself inside his church and listened while his congregation, the people he was responsible for, who came to him for sanctuary, died outside the door because he was too frightened to open it. He has been living with this for the better part of a year. Gabriel is, to put it gently, not adjusted to the world as it currently exists. He refuses to fight. He refuses to hold a weapon. He leaves the church at night alone, in the dark, and comes back with walker bites on his shoe from stepping on walkers' hands. He leads a group of walkers to the school where the group has taken shelter by being careless about covering his trail. He goes to Alexandria's food pantry and attempts to tell the community's leader that the group is dangerous and should be expelled immediately before they have established themselves, for reasons that aren't entirely coherent, even by Gabriel's standards. Gabriel eventually becomes a meaningful character. His arc through the later seasons, the slow, painful rebuilding of his courage, is genuinely earned. But his early episodes are a masterclass in a person who has been fundamentally broken by what he did, who is transferring his guilt outward in ways that make him actively dangerous to the people around him, and who nobody in the group does a particularly good job of addressing or watching. Eugene's lie is the other major decision of this season worth spending time on. Eugene Porter tells Abraham, and then through Abraham everyone, that he is a scientist who worked with the Human Genome Project, that he knows what caused the outbreak, and that he needs to get to Washington, D.C. to deliver this information to people who can use it to fix the world. This is why the Washington mission starts. This is why Abraham has spent the better part of a year keeping Eugene alive, moving him across dangerous territory, building a purpose around the idea that Eugene holds the key to saving humanity. Eugene doesn't know what caused the outbreak. He's never been a scientist in any relevant sense. He invented the mission because he's smart enough to know he couldn't survive alone, and clever enough to figure out what someone would need to believe to keep him protected. He confesses this midway through Season 5 after being punched in the face by Abraham in the middle of a road in Georgia. He says it flatly. He was lying. He's sorry. He doesn't know anything. Abraham sits in the road for a long time after this. The show gives this its due weight. The thing Abraham has been doing with his life, the thing that replaced nihilism, that gave him a reason to keep going, was built on a mullet and a soft-spoken lie. The decision Eugene made to keep lying for as long as he possibly could is understandable in the same way that most desperate survival choices are understandable. It is also, by any reasonable measure, one of the more significant personal deceptions in the show's run. They go to Alexandria anyway, not because of Eugene's mission, just because Alexandria is in that direction, and Alexandria turns out to be real. The transition from the road to Alexandria is one of the show's stranger structural pivots, because it requires the group to go from maximum threat awareness, the road through Georgia and Virginia, the encounter with the Terminus cannibals, the hospital, everything, to arriving at a functioning community with fences and solar power and people who haven't had blood on their hands, and then trying to integrate. The group's approach to Alexandria in the first few episodes is almost comically suspicious. They sleep together in one house. They keep their weapons close. Rick tells the group privately that if Alexandria doesn't work out, they'll just take it. He says this within days of arriving, before anything has happened to justify it. He's threat modelling a community of people who are, so far, generous and welcoming. This is probably wise given what happened at Terminus. It is also a reminder of how thoroughly the road had reshaped who they were. The people of Alexandria, conversely, have largely been sheltered. Deanna Monroe, who runs the community, is a former congresswoman with genuine political skills and a reasonably clear-eyed assessment of what the group might offer. Her husband was an architect and built things. Her son Spencer is the one who later tries to negotiate with Negan. The community is functional but soft in a specific way, capable of maintaining stability, but not of the kind of rapid, violent decision-making the world outside the walls requires. The friction between the group's hard-edged capability and Alexandria's relative comfort is the show's dominant tension for most of seasons 5 and 6, and it plays out in decisions on both sides. Rick moves too fast, too aggressively, too willing to override the community's established trust structures. The Alexandrians move too slowly, too attached to protocols that made sense before the world ended. Neither side is entirely right. Neither side adjusts as much as they probably should. And then the wolves attack, and the dumpster happens and Negan arrives, and the question of how two different cultures learn to occupy the same community becomes somewhat less pressing, because everyone has more immediate problems. Season 6 is where the show begins building in earnest toward Negan and the Saviors, and it does this through a series of increasingly consequential decisions that are all in their own way expressions of the same underlying problem. The group keeps making confident choices based on insufficient information, and then being surprised when the information they didn't have turns out to be relevant. But let's start with the dumpster, because we have to. Midway through Season 6, Glenn and Nicholas are on a supply run in a town that's being used to redirect a massive walker herd. Things go wrong. They end up on a dumpster, surrounded. Nicholas, who has a history of cowardice, and who Glenn has been quietly mentoring, panics. He shoots himself. His body falls against Glenn, and they both go over the edge of the dumpster into the crowd of walkers. The show cuts away. The next scene shows the walkers swarming, then walking away. Glenn's name is removed from the opening credits. The show does not confirm Glenn's fate for 3 episodes and approximately 2 real-world weeks. There are theories, there are frame-by-frame analyses, there are online arguments about whether Glenn was under the dumpster or being eaten. His fate is one of the most widely discussed open questions the show had generated since the barn reveal. He was under the dumpster. He'd rolled under it while Nicholas's body was pulled away by walkers. He was hiding and waiting. He crawls out eventually, finds a bottle of water that Enid had left, and makes his way back. The audience's reaction to this was not uncomplicated. Some people were relieved and grateful. Many were genuinely frustrated. The issue wasn't that Glenn survived. That was welcome. The issue was that the show had used the possibility of Glenn's death as a mechanism for generating engagement and discussion, rather than as a genuine story beat. The show had taught the audience to take major character deaths seriously, and it used that seriousness here to manufacture a weeks-long conversation about something that turned out not to have happened. This is the dumpster's place in the history of The Walking Dead's relationship with its audience. A production decision, not a character decision. But it changes something. Now the Wolves, a group called the Wolves, survivalist scavengers who've adopted a nihilistic philosophy about the Walker world, attack Alexandria in Season 6 while most of the group is away. Morgan, who has just arrived at Alexandria, has captured one of the wolves during the attack and is hiding him in a house, trying to rehabilitate him through conversation. The idea for Morgan is that every person has the potential to come back from what they've become. It's a belief system that the show has been developing for him carefully since his reappearance in Season 3. Carol finds out about the captive wolf. She decides to kill him. Morgan stops her. The wolf escapes. During his escape, he takes Denise Cloyd, Alexandria's doctor, as a hostage. His subsequent actions contribute directly to Denise's death. This is not simple to assign blame for. Morgan's belief in rehabilitation is genuine, and the show takes it seriously. Carol's pragmatism is equally genuine. But the practical outcome, a dangerous captive hidden from the community's leadership, in a community that's currently under attack, illustrates the cost of individual decision-making during collective emergencies. Both Morgan and Carol made choices that prioritized their personal moral frameworks over the group's safety, and the gap between those frameworks had a body count. And that brings us to Denise. Denise Cloyd is Alexandria's doctor. She's been learning on the job. She was a psychiatry resident before the apocalypse, not a surgeon, and she's been teaching herself everything she knows about treating the injuries the group keeps sustaining. She is functionally irreplaceable. If she dies, Alexandria has no medical professional. Denise joins Daryl and Rosita on a supply run in the episode Twice as Far. She specifically asks to go. She wants to push herself. She wants to prove to herself that she can handle the world outside the walls. This is understandable. She's been sheltered, she knows it, and she wants to change that. On the way back, she stops at an abandoned car because she can see a cooler in the front seat that might have medical supplies. She climbs inside the car. There is a walker inside the car as well, and a horrible waterlogged sneaker that the show treats as a significant character moment. She climbs back out, nearly gets bitten, and then stands on the train tracks holding a can of orange soda that she found. She wanted it for Tara, her girlfriend, and she gives a speech about bravery. While she's giving the speech, an arrow goes through her eye. She was mid-sentence. It's one of the show's most sudden deaths. The saviors, specifically Dwight, were watching from the tree line. They'd been following. Denise was Alexandria's only doctor. She joined a supply run she had no tactical reason to be on, during a period of escalating threat from an unknown faction, to work through a personal growth moment that could have waited. This is not a criticism of her as a person, but bringing the settlement's only medical professional on an unarmed excursion at that particular moment was the kind of decision that looks fine right up until it doesn't. And the show doesn't really engage with that in the aftermath. Her death is treated as a personal loss, which it is, rather than as a community infrastructure failure, which it also is. Now, the preemptive attack on the saviors. This is the Season 6 decision that has the longest consequences. The Hilltop tells Rick's group about the saviors. They describe a community that extorts other settlements, takes resources, and maintains control through fear and violence. They describe one outpost, a mid-sized building, as the primary savior base. Rick's group decides to attack this outpost at night, kill the people inside, and eliminate the savior threat before it reaches Alexandria. The attack happens. They move through the building. They kill people who are sleeping. They find cells that suggest this is a prison as well as a base. They find Polaroid photos on a wall that are disturbing. They find something that looks like a person being stored. Alive? Dead? It's not clear. In a cell. The attack succeeds. They get out. What they do not know, what nobody tells them, because nobody asks in enough detail, is that the outpost they attacked is one of many. The Saviors are not a single building. They are an organisation with multiple bases, hundreds of members, and a leader called Negan, who operates through a franchise model of tribute and fear. The Hilltop, when describing the Saviors, was describing the faction they interacted with. They were not describing the whole picture, and Rick's group didn't push for the whole picture before committing to the attack. The attack on the outpost is the thing that makes Negan appear at the end of Season 6 with Lucille. It's the thing that triggers the lineup. The show doesn't frame this as a mistake exactly. It frames it as Rick's group reaching beyond their information. But the decision to eliminate a threat they hadn't fully mapped, based on second-hand intelligence from a community they'd known for 2 days, is one of the most consequential errors in the show's run, and it arrives wearing the costume of a reasonable, tactical decision. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Something worth adding about Season 6's finale, which is where all of the accumulated decisions of that season land at once. The group is in a van trying to get Maggie to the Hilltop for medical care. They keep hitting Saviour roadblocks. Each time they turn around, there's another one. The Saviours are herding them. The group doesn't immediately understand this, even though the pattern is visible by the second or third roadblock. Sasha radios back to Alexandria, and they eventually realise they're being played. By then, it's too late. They're forced out of the vehicle at night. Negan and his people are waiting. All of Rick's group, everyone who matters, is on their knees in a field, surrounded by dozens of armed saviors. And Negan walks out with Lucille. The season ends on a subjective shot. Negan swings, the screen goes dark, and the audience spends the entire summer not knowing who he killed. It was Abraham first, then Glenn when Daryl hit Negan in anger, though we don't learn this until the Season 7 premiere. The cliffhanger is the other production-level decision that, like the dumpster, changes the audience's relationship with the show's stakes. A character is killed in a way specifically designed to generate discussion, speculation, and engagement during the gap between seasons. The show treats its own dramatic weight as a marketing mechanism, and enough of the audience noticed the gap between those two things that the Season 7 premiere, which was genuinely devastating and brilliantly performed, was received with a complicated mixture of grief and wariness that the show never quite resolved. Carl's arc across Season 6 also deserves a mention, because Carl becomes genuinely interesting in this period. He's shot in the eye during the Wolves' attack on Alexandria. Ron Anderson shoots him while trying to shoot Rick, and the recovery from the injury and the aftermath of nearly dying changes something in him. He starts looking at the world differently. He starts making room for other people's experiences in a way that teenage Carl in the earlier seasons wasn't capable of. The eye injury is the moment the show commits fully to Carl as a character with an arc toward adulthood, rather than as an obstacle to narrative momentum. And then the show kills him in Season 8, during the Whisperer conflict, off-screen, from a walker bite, while his family is focused elsewhere. It's a death that the writers clearly meant to be meaningful, and that landed for many viewers as something else entirely. The character who'd been growing into the show's future, the one Rick kept describing as the reason for building a better world, was killed in a way that felt like a choice driven more by the actor's availability and the show's desire to shock than by the story's internal logic. But that's Season 8 territory, and we've already been there. Life Under Negan, Spencer's Gambit, and the Trash People season. 7 is structurally the submission season. Its entire purpose is to show the full weight of what it looks like when Rick Grimes, specifically Rick Grimes, who has been the functional centre of every group he's ever been in, has been brought to his knees by someone more ruthless. It works on those terms. Andrew Lincoln's performance in the first episode, the one where Glenn and Abraham die, is quietly devastating. The scene where Rick has to nearly take Carl's arm with a hatchet to demonstrate compliance is one of the most difficult scenes in the series. But the season also requires the group to make extended decisions to remain passive and compliant, while Negan and his people do whatever they want in Alexandria, and watching those decisions accumulate has its own particular quality. The basic logic of Rick's position is clear. The Saviors have numbers, weapons, and infrastructure that Alexandria, the Hilltop, and the Kingdom combined can't match yet. Resisting immediately would mean a massacre. The compliance is tactical, it's buying time. This is an entirely valid strategic reading of the situation. Where it becomes difficult to follow is when the compliance extends to letting Negan walk Olivia through the pantry and comment on her weight, to watching Negan sprawl across the living room furniture, to handing over weapons, medical supplies, and mattresses while the community's residents watch through windows. The performance of helplessness is strategically necessary, but watching the group perform it for most of a season is genuinely uncomfortable, in a way the show seems to intend, but that doesn't make it easier to sit with. Now let's talk about Spencer. Spencer Monroe has been a presence in Alexandria since the group arrived. He's Rick's most consistent internal critic, convinced that Rick's leadership style is dangerous, that there are better options, that the group's aggressive approach to every new situation creates more problems than it solves. Some of Spencer's criticisms are fair. His execution is consistently the issue. Spencer, in the episode Heart Still Beating, decides to approach Negan directly. He does this outside, in the street, in front of the Alexandria community. He brings a bottle of liquor and a chess set. He and Negan play chess and drink in full view of everyone, and Spencer proposes essentially that Negan replace Rick with Spencer. His pitch is that Rick has a history of making decisions that cost people their lives, that Spencer comes from a political family and would be a more suitable community leader, and that Negan would be better served with someone cooperative running Alexandria rather than someone who is simply afraid. Negan's response, and it's one of the show's better Negan moments, is to stab Spencer through the stomach. He explains his reasoning. Spencer, by coming to him privately and proposing that someone else be removed, demonstrated that he didn't have the courage to deal with his problems directly. Negan finds this repellent in a specific way. He says Rick might hate him, but Rick does what Negan says, and that takes guts. Spencer had guts, Negan notes, and then gestures to where Spencer's guts are on the street. What's interesting about Spencer's decision is that it wasn't entirely stupid as an instinct. Approaching a powerful person to negotiate a change of leadership is something that happens in functional politics all the time. But Spencer had spent the season complaining to anyone who would listen that Rick was dangerous, without building any actual coalition behind his position, and then made his move to the most dangerous possible audience in the most public possible setting. It had the shape of a power play, with none of the preparation. Sasha and Rosita's assassination attempt is a different kind of decision, and the show treats it differently, with more sympathy, because both of them are acting out of genuine grief rather than ambition. Rosita has been building a bullet, one bullet from salvaged materials, because she wants to kill Negan. Sasha, who has lost Bob and Tyrese and Abraham, is in a similar place. They decide to go to the sanctuary together and take a shot. The plan is, get to the sanctuary, find a position, take a shot at Negan. That's most of the plan. It's acknowledged within the show that the plan is incomplete and probably fatal for both of them. They go anyway. They get into position. They take the shot. It misses. Sasha is captured. Rosita escapes after Eugene is taken instead. Sasha is used against Rick's group in the season finale. Eugene, who surrendered when Rosita was cornered, spends the rest of the season adapting to life as a savior in ways that the group will spend a long time processing. The decision is human. Both women are operating from a place of grief that the show has traced carefully across multiple seasons. The practical failure of the attempt and the cost it extracts is also something the show traces carefully. Both things can be true. And then there are the scavengers. The scavengers, also called the heap people, or less charitably, the trash people, are one of the more peculiar creative decisions of Season 7. They live in a giant pile of rubbish outside the city. They speak in stripped-down, fragmented sentences that don't quite sound like English. Their leader, Jadis, communicates in a kind of minimalist poetic register that is either a creative stylistic choice or one of the stranger performances in the series, depending on how generously you're feeling. Rick finds them in episode 9 or 10, I think, and decides they're a potential ally against Negan. He negotiates with Jadis. She drives a very hard bargain. Rick agrees to her terms, guns mostly, and the scavengers join the resistance plan. The alliance feels shaky from the first scene. Jadis's group doesn't behave like a community that has developed trust-based norms. Their settlement suggests a group that survives through scavenging and adaptability rather than through cooperation and relationship. Rick's faith in the alliance, which he builds the season's climax around, feels like the show asking you to believe something the evidence in the scenes doesn't support. In the season finale, the scavengers betray the plan. Jadis shoots Rick. The saviors show up prepared because the scavengers told them. Everything collapses. I find myself almost charmed by how thoroughly the scavengers turned out to be exactly what they looked like. They looked like people who would betray you. They behaved like people who would betray you, and they behaved exactly like people who were planning to betray you right up until they did it. The show earned this outcome. Whether the audience was supposed to trust the alliance in the first place is a question the season doesn't quite answer. But the result? Rick on his knees in front of Negan again, everything in ruins, is at least consistent with the setup. A few more things about Season 7 before we move on, because Dwight and the Kingdom both have relevant threads. Dwight is introduced in Season 6 as a saviour who steals from Daryl and escapes. He comes back in Season 7 as one of Negan's more trusted lieutenants, distinguished by the half of his face that's been burned with an iron as punishment for running away. He's also secretly working against Negan, feeding information to Rick's group through a series of cryptic signals that the show drip feeds across the season. The decision to trust Dwight is one that Daryl resists for obvious reasons. Dwight stole from him, burned his face, and shot him with an arrow. Rick eventually decides to work with him. The alliance with Dwight is one of the more interesting moral calculations in this stretch of the show, because Dwight has done genuinely terrible things, and his motivation for betraying Negan is entirely personal. He wants Sherry back, or at least wants to be free of what happened to them. It's not altruism, it's not conviction. He's using the group as much as they're using him. The show is honest about this. Daryl never forgives him. The audience is not asked to. The Kingdom, meanwhile, is introduced in Season 7 as a community built around Ezekiel and his tiger, and it's the show being genuinely playful about its own premise. There's a man with a tiger. He delivers his dialogue in a semi-theatrical register. He rules through the performance of a kind of benevolent monarchy that his people know is a performance and participate in anyway. It's one of the more creative things the show did in its later years. This idea that fiction, shared fiction, can be the foundation of a community's hope. The decisions Ezekiel makes in Season 7, including the one to hide the Kingdom's arrangement with the saviors from his people, are driven by the same logic as his theatrical persona. He believes that his people need him to be certain, and that showing them the true weight of their situation would break the thing that holds them together. He might be right about his community. The cost of the secret, when it comes out, is significant. The Kingdom's decision to hide the tribute arrangement from its own people is one of the season's more quietly interesting ethical puzzles. Ezekiel has been paying the saviors in food and supplies to keep them away. He's been doing this before Rick's group arrives, before the resistance plan exists, before there was any alternative. His people don't know. He's been protecting them by lying to them, and the lie has given them the stability to plant crops and build walls, and feel, for the first time in years, like something resembling safety was possible. When it comes out, and it does because these things always come out, the community's response is not straightforward betrayal. It's more complicated than that. Some people understand. Some people are furious. Ezekiel's performance of certainty, which the show established early on as a conscious choice rather than a natural state, collapses. He sits in the throne room alone. He sends people away. The tiger is still there. The crown is still there. The man underneath them is trying to figure out who he is without the fiction. This is one of the things the show does well in its mid-period, showing the cost of leadership as performance. Ezekiel built a community on the story of who he was, and the story worked. People believed it. People thrived inside it. And when the story became unsustainable, when the thing it was protecting against couldn't be hidden anymore, the community had to decide whether it could survive without the fiction. It could. They found a way, but it required Ezekiel to rebuild himself from something closer to honesty, which is harder than building from a myth. Season 8 picks up the war properly, and the war has its own very specific set of problems. All-out war is the phrase the show uses for Season 8, and it delivers on the war part. There are gunfights, sieges, ambushes, and a finale that reshapes the show's direction for the following 3 seasons. The decisions made during this war are, on balance, some of the most interesting in the series, partly because several of them are decisions that Rick and the group are making under pressure with actually adequate resources. For the first time, they have numbers, they have weapons, They have allies. The question becomes what they do with that. The plan for the opening assault is ambitious. Multiple communities converge on the sanctuary, Negan's main base, simultaneously. Rick's group, the Hilltop, and the Kingdom all move in coordination. The plan is to surround the sanctuary with a massive walker herd, pin the saviors inside, cut off their supply lines, and systematically take out their outposts while they're contained. This is actually a sophisticated plan. The logistics are real, the coordination is real, and in the first episode of the season, it works, or starts to work. The saviors are pinned. The herd is moving. The plan is in motion. And then it falls apart because the plan required too many simultaneous things to go right. The sequence of events that unshackles the saviors from the sanctuary is partly Eugene's doing. He figures out how to use the speakers to lead the walker herd away, and partly the result of the overall complexity of the operation. Too many moving parts, too little margin for error. The plan that was supposed to end the war in days extends it for most of a season. The Kingdom's assault on Saviour outposts runs parallel to this and has its own trajectory. Ezekiel's forces for several episodes are winning. They hit outpost after outpost with coordinated ambushes and take minimal casualties. Ezekiel becomes something approaching triumphant, which in this show is always a precursor to a correction. At the fourth outpost, a saviour defector has warned the garrison. The ambush is reversed. Most of the Kingdom's fighters are killed. Ezekiel survives because Jerry, one of the show's most quietly beloved characters, stays behind to protect his retreat. The cost is enormous. The Kingdom loses most of its military capacity in a single engagement. The lesson the show is drawing seems to be about the hubris of the winning streak, the way that success in a pattern makes you underestimate the moment when the pattern breaks. Ezekiel's confidence, which had been earned by genuine victories, didn't account for the possibility that intelligence could be compromised, which is a real limitation of warfare, not really a personal failure. But the show frames it as connected to his sense of himself, as a leader, which adds a layer to it that feels earned. Morgan's arc in Season 8 is the one that's hardest to summarise cleanly. Morgan has been oscillating since his reappearance between committed non-violence and sudden total violence, and Season 8 is where that oscillation becomes most extreme. He kills. He kills extensively. He kills people who might not have needed to be killed. He has conversations with visions of dead people. He exists in a kind of dissociative state for much of the season. The show treats this as the psychological cost of prolonged warfare on a specific kind of person, someone for whom violence was already traumatizing before the apocalypse, who built a code around non-violence as a survival mechanism, and who is now fighting a war. Morgan's arc is coherent as a portrait of trauma. It's less coherent as a series of decisions, because Morgan in Season 8 isn't really making decisions in the traditional sense. He's reacting. Several of those reactions have serious consequences for the people around him. He eventually leaves. He transfers to Fear the Walking Dead, which feels like both a narrative resolution and a structural acknowledgement that the show didn't quite know what to do with him by the end of the season. And then the finale, Rick and Negan. They meet face to face on a ridge in front of both armies. Rick offers Negan a future. He describes the world Herschel talked about, the one where the communities can all work together, where the system they've built can become the foundation for something new. Negan seems to consider it. Rick mentions Herschel. Negan pauses, and Rick slashes his throat. Immediately, Rick orders Siddiq to save him. While the medics rush to treat the wound, Rick turns to Maggie and says this is what Negan deserves: to live, to see the new world built without him, to serve as a reminder of what they're building away from. Maggie is furious. Maggie has a legitimate grievance. Glenn is dead. Her husband was murdered in front of her by this man. The promise of the new world doesn't neutralize the arithmetic of that fact for her. Her anger is not irrational. It's not small. She's right that leaving Negan alive is a permanent instability in the foundation of everything they're building. Rick's reasoning, and the show's reasoning through Rick, is that breaking the cycle requires someone to make a decision that isn't about revenge. That executing Negan, however justified, would be the old world's logic applied to the new one. That the new world, to be different, has to actually be different, which means sparing a person you have every human reason to kill. This is a real moral argument. It is also an argument that requires every person in the group who lost someone to Negan's bat to accept that their grief is subordinate to a principle. Maggie never accepts that. Daryl never entirely accepts it. The season ends with Rick exiling Maggie's supporter Daryl, letting Negan live in a cell, and the show slowly separating people who've been together since season 2. Whether Rick was right is a question the show spends several more seasons with, and never quite answers definitively, which is probably appropriate. Real moral questions don't tend to resolve neatly. Something worth adding about what happens to Maggie after Rick spares Negan, because her arc in season 8's final episodes is one of the more honest things the show does with the consequences of this decision. Maggie doesn't accept the outcome. She says so clearly. She and Jesus plan to undermine Rick's new arrangement from Hilltop. She's going to give Negan what she deserves, as she puts it. The show leaves this as a dangling thread at the end of season 8, and it becomes one of the several reasons the show's architecture becomes complicated in season 9. Lauren Cohan, who plays Maggie, left the show for most of season 9 due to contractual disputes. Maggie's story is handled through her absence. She's gone to work at a community called Georgie's, which the audience barely knows. Her unresolved anger at Rick, and later at Michonne, becomes a weight the show carries without quite knowing what to do with it, until Maggie returns in season 10 and eventually resolves her feelings about Negan in the spin-off Dead City. This is one of the places where the show's production realities and its narrative priorities came into genuine conflict. Maggie's arc had a clear emotional trajectory. She needed to either confront Negan or come to terms with not doing so, and either resolution required her presence in the show. The absence created a gap in the narrative that the later seasons tried to paper over and never entirely managed. Also worth noting, Gabriel's season 8 arc involves him being trapped with Negan in a car surrounded by walkers, driving through a field with him, and then living in the sanctuary as Negan's unwilling chaplain for several episodes. This is genuinely strange television. Negan and Gabriel's conversations about faith, about the nature of God in a world where the dead walk, are some of the more unusual things the show attempted in its later seasons. They work better than they have any right to. Two characters who should have no functional dynamic finding genuine friction through theology is not something you'd have predicted from season 1, and it's a reminder that the show, even at its most uneven, occasionally found angles it had no right to find. Seasons 9 and 10 represent a genuine creative pivot. The time skip between seasons 8 and 9, a year and a half into the future, is probably the best structural decision the show made in its final stretch. It allowed the world to rebuild, gave characters room to change, and let the show become something other than a war narrative for the first time since season 6. The communities are actually communities now. There are crops and governance structures and something resembling normal life. And then several significant decisions complicate all of that. Rick's final episode, his exit from the main show, involves him leading a massive walker herd away from a bridge the communities are building. The bridge is meant to connect the settlements physically, to make the rebuilt world more coherent and mutually supportive. It's Rick's project. It's the concrete expression of everything he was trying to build after the war. The herd approaches the bridge during a crisis moment. Rick rides out alone to lead the herd away. He ends up on the bridge with no escape route, surrounded on all sides, with dynamite nearby. He makes a decision. He shoots the dynamite. The bridge explodes. The herd is destroyed. Rick is presumed dead. He's not dead. The helicopter takes him, but the group doesn't know that. As far as Michonne and Carl's daughter Judith and everyone who loved Rick Grimes is concerned, he died on that bridge to save the communities he'd spent years building. The decision to shoot the dynamite, rather than find another way off the bridge, is presented as sacrifice, which it is. But it's also worth noting that Rick was the one who put himself in the position of being alone on the bridge with a walker herd bearing down on him. The plan required him to be the bait. Other options existed. There were people who could have driven the vehicle away from the herd, or led the herd on a different route, who were not the leader of 4 allied communities. Rick consistently, throughout the series, places himself at the sharpest point of the spear, and the bridge is where that pattern reaches its logical end. Michonne takes on the burden of leading after Rick's disappearance, and she does it with a controlled grief that becomes one of the more interesting character evolutions in the later seasons. Alexandria pulls back from the other communities. Michonne makes decisions that reflect her pain without being entirely defensible as policy. The isolation that Alexandria develops in the years following Rick's presumed death is a consequence of one person's grief reshaping a community's external relationships, and the show traces that honestly. Now, the Whisperers, Alpha and Beta and the Whisperers, are the show's most conceptually ambitious villain faction. They wear the skins of walkers. They move with the herds. They have rejected everything about civilization, not just the forms of it, like the saviors did, but the idea of it. They don't believe in communities or names or attachment. They believe in the logic of survival in its most stripped-down form, which is that attachment is weakness. The show sets up the Whisperer threat clearly and takes its time developing Alpha as a character, and then the communities host a fair. The inter-community fair is one of the more optimistic things the show attempts in its later seasons. It's a genuine expression of what the rebuilding project is supposed to mean. People from different settlements coming together, trading, celebrating, briefly feeling something other than vigilant. The sequence of the fair itself is warm and well handled, with callbacks to relationships the show has been building and small moments that feel earned. Alpha walks through it wearing a disguise. She moves through the fair looking at the community's people. She identifies specific individuals from different settlements. Later heads on pikes mark the boundary of Whisperer territory. 10 people, most of them supporting characters, but including Enid, Henry, and Tara. It's one of the more genuinely horrifying things the show does in its later period. The question the show doesn't quite address in the aftermath is how Alpha got in. The fair had people arriving from multiple communities on a specific day for a specific event. The security at a gathering that size, during an active conflict with a faction that is known to use infiltration, was not what it perhaps should have been. Nobody identified Alpha until after the damage was done. And the show moves fairly quickly past the question of how she got in, preferring to focus on the emotional weight of who was killed. There are 2 more decisions from this stretch worth spending a moment on. Siddiq, who survived the massacre at the Pikes, is traumatized. This is clear. He has flashbacks. He has dissociative episodes during surgery. He's the settlement's doctor, operating under these conditions for an extended period while the people around him acknowledge that he's struggling and then mostly continue asking him to do his job. The show treats Siddiq's PTSD with genuine care and eventually resolves it through a reveal that recontextualizes his trauma entirely. Dante, a spy for the Whisperers, has been embedded in Alexandria and has been subtly exacerbating Siddiq's symptoms. This is a good narrative turn. But the months before that reveal, in which Siddiq is visibly unwell and nobody in the community does anything structural to address it, doesn't find him alternative support, doesn't reduce his surgical load, doesn't have a sustained conversation about what he needs, is a period of sustained care failure that the show is quieter about than it is about the Pikes themselves. And then there's Henry. Henry is Carol and Ezekiel's adopted son, and in season 10 he decides to go find Lydia, Alpha's daughter, who he's developed feelings for, at the Whisperer camp. He goes essentially alone, or as close to alone as the show can arrange. He is captured. This leads to Daryl going in after him in a walker disguise, which is one of the more tense sequences of the season, and eventually to the whole Lydia situation that reshapes the middle part of the season. Henry's decision to walk to the most dangerous place in the known world for a girl he'd known for a few weeks is very much in the tradition of decisions that TWD's teenage characters make. It has a clear, emotional logic. It is also the kind of logic that the adults around him should probably have anticipated and done something about before it became a situation Daryl had to resolve at significant personal risk. Season 10 ends with Carol making a decision that pulls a large chunk of the Whisperer herd toward a cliff, destroying most of it, but also destroying the cave where the communities had been planning a confrontation with Alpha. It works. It's characteristically Carol. Efficient, ruthless, high cost. The show ends the season on the image of the aftermath and the communities rebuilding again. Before we get to season 11, there are a couple of threads from this period worth acknowledging. Negan's redemption arc across seasons 9 and 10 is one of the more ambitious things the late show attempted. He's been in a cell for years. He's lost his power, his followers, his infrastructure, and the show slowly gives him room to be something other than a tyrant. Working in the garden, having conversations with Judith Grimes, trying to find a version of himself that might be sustainable in a world that doesn't need him to be Negan. The moment the show uses to test whether this is real is his encounter with Alpha. He joins the Whisperers, earns Alpha's trust, and then kills her, decapitating her and bringing her head to Carol. It's an act of violence in service of the communities, which is the redemption arc's apparent conclusion. And the show handles it well, but it also requires Negan to have been genuinely changed by years of imprisonment, while also being capable of the specific kind of cold, efficient violence that the killing of Alpha requires. Whether those two things are compatible is a question the show gestures toward without fully engaging. Judith Grimes is worth a mention here, because she becomes increasingly important in this stretch, and her decision-making, for a child raised in the apocalypse, is remarkable. She's her father's daughter in the most literal sense. She makes decisive calls, she carries weapons, she knows exactly when to threaten and when to trust. The show doesn't spend as much time on her as it perhaps should, but the moments it gives her are good ones. She shoots Negan to prevent him from leaving the community alone. She argues with her mother about Alexandria's isolation from the other communities. She's 11 or 12 years old, and she has clearer strategic thinking than most adults in the show's first 3 seasons. The timeline situation, incidentally, is one the show handles with slightly variable rigor. Rick's disappearance happens when Judith is an infant. By the time we see her regularly, in season 9 and 10, she's approximately 10 years old, which implies roughly a decade has passed since the events of season 1. Characters have aged inconsistently throughout, and the show has never been rigidly mathematical about its timeline. This is fine. It's a story, not a historical record, but it's something you notice if you spend enough time with it, which at this hour we clearly have. Season 11 is the last. The Commonwealth is waiting. Season 11 is the longest season the show ever produced, 24 episodes across 3 years of production, and it introduces the Commonwealth, which is the most ambitious community the show attempts. A fully functioning city of 50,000 people with class hierarchies, a professional army, a mayor, a newspaper, entertainment, restaurants. It looks like the world came back. The Commonwealth is the show's final testing ground. For the question, it's been circling since the very first season. What does civilization actually look like when it comes back? And what does it cost to maintain it? The answer the show arrives at is, it looks like what civilization always looks like, which is that the people with power tend to use it primarily to maintain their power, and the structures that make a community functional also make inequality structural. Pamela Milton is the governor of the Commonwealth, and she is the season's primary antagonist. She is not unreasonable in the way the governor was unreasonable, or brutal in the way Negan was brutal. She is something more recognizable, a political leader who has internalized the hierarchy so completely that she can no longer distinguish between protecting the community and protecting herself. She makes decisions that are defensible from within the system she's built and indefensible from outside it. She exiles people. She uses the army as personal security. She allows the underclass of the Commonwealth to suffer rather than address the structural issues that created it. The group identifies this fairly early. Connie writes about it. Daryl sees it. Maggie, who has been building Hilltop back from nothing, has zero patience for it. Various characters have various conversations about working within the system versus refusing it. The problem is that working within the system requires the group to act as though the system is functional when the evidence that it isn't keeps accumulating. Governor Milton uses a walker herd as a weapon against a riot of Commonwealth underclass residents. She essentially weaponizes the dead against her own people. This is the moment the show has been building toward, the unambiguous demonstration that she will not change from within. And yet it takes until the final episode, roughly, for the group's resistance to coalesce into anything that changes the situation. There's a specific pattern in Season 11 that's worth naming. Multiple characters, multiple times, are in positions where they could present evidence to the community, make public arguments, escalate the conflict, past the point where the governor can manage it quietly, and they don't. They whisper, they plan, they operate in small groups. The show's logic seems to be that the community isn't ready to hear it, that the moment has to be right. But the cost of waiting for the right moment in this particular season is a body count that extends through most of the final stretch. General Mercer is the most interesting character in this respect. He's a capable, ethical military leader who is working for a corrupt government and knows it. He has the loyalty of the army. He has the access. His eventual decision to side with the group against Pamela happens in the finale, and it's satisfying. There's a clarity to him that makes his choice feel earned. But the timeline of Mercer's gradual recognition that he needs to act while he continues following orders that he disagrees with for most of the season is one of the places where the season's pacing is most visible as a structural choice, rather than a character inevitability. Eugene's trial is the season's most extended procedural drama. He's on trial for the death of a Commonwealth soldier, events he had nothing to do with, but which are being used as a pretext to discredit the group's growing influence. The trial is manipulated, the evidence is being managed. Multiple characters know the truth of what happened and could, in principle, simply say it loudly in a public setting. Instead, the trial runs for several episodes, with various characters attempting to navigate the Commonwealth's legal system from within. The impulse to work through legitimate channels is understandable. It's consistent with who these characters are by Season 11, people who have spent years trying to build something rather than tear things down. But the legitimate channels are controlled by the person who arranged the trial. The show takes its time acknowledging this. A quick thing about the Commonwealth's class system, because I find it genuinely interesting as a world-building detail. When new arrivals come to the Commonwealth, they're assigned a role based on what they did before the apocalypse. Former lawyers become lawyers, former doctors become doctors, former teachers become teachers, and everyone else, the people who survived by learning whatever skill the moment required, who might have been a checkout assistant in 2019 and a field surgeon by 2022, gets assigned to lower status work. Rick's group, when they arrive, get sorted into various roles that often don't reflect what they've actually become. The irony is profound, and the show knows it. These are people who rebuilt civilization by being flexible, adaptive, and willing to do whatever was needed. The Commonwealth reifies them back into who they were before any of that happened. The season's final episodes move at a pace that feels compressed after the long middle stretch. The Commonwealth's collapse, the community's reformation, the characters' resolutions, it all happens fairly quickly. Some things are left open that the spin-offs would eventually address. Some things are resolved in ways that feel proportionate to the investment, and some things, frankly, require the characters to make slower, more deliberate decisions than they probably would given everything they've been through, because the emotional beats of the finale needed space to breathe. The show ends. 11 seasons, Rick Grimes and Michonne, and Judith and everyone who was still standing. It's a considerable achievement, whatever its inconsistencies. A few final things about the Commonwealth period that felt unresolved in interesting ways. Connie's arc across seasons 10 and 11 is one of the show's better examples of the show finding something genuinely new. She's deaf, she communicates through signing and notes, and she's a journalist. The Commonwealth newspaper eventually becomes the mechanism through which the corruption gets documented. Her survival after being buried in a cave full of walkers, a plot point that the show took its time resolving, demonstrates a toughness that was earned through multiple seasons of being underestimated. Her relationship with Daryl is one of the more quietly developed things in the later seasons. The show never quite gives it the space it would need to fully develop, but what's there is warm and specific in a way that later TWD relationships sometimes weren't. The character of Yumiko, who becomes the group's de facto legal representative during Eugene's trial, is interesting because she was a lawyer before the apocalypse, and the Commonwealth offers her the chance to practice again. She's good at it. The show uses her to demonstrate what the reintegration of pre-apocalypse professional skills might look like when a community gets large enough to need them. There's something genuinely optimistic about this, the idea that the things people knew before the world ended might become useful again, that specialization and expertise might have a place in the rebuilt world. It's one of the better ideas embedded in the Commonwealth as a setting. The final battle's shape, communities rising against an authoritarian power structure using a walker herd as the catalyst, is the show doing what it always did when it was working well, using the zombie premise as a vehicle for something else. The walkers aren't really the threat in the finale. They're the thing that strips away Pamela's ability to maintain order, that forces everyone in the city to make a choice, that collapses the distance between the people with walls and the people without them. It's a bit of a mess, honestly, but it has the right spirit. There's something genuinely satisfying about the show ending on that image. People rebuilding again, because that's just what they do. The decisions, good and bad and bewildering and heartbreaking, were always in service of that question underneath everything. What kind of people are we when the structures that used to hold us together are gone? After 11 seasons, the answer the show kept arriving at was the same one it started with. Imperfect ones, trying their best, getting it wrong in ways that were completely understandable given everything. That's not a bad place to land for a show about the end of the world. So that's where we leave it. 11 seasons, hundreds of decisions, and one recurring pattern running through all of it. That people in impossible situations make choices based on what they can see and what they need to believe. And those choices compound across time in ways that nobody could entirely predict at the moment of making them. The thing I keep coming back to, thinking about all of this, is that the mistakes are inseparable from what made the show worth watching. You can't have Rick Grimes making the wrong call without also having Rick Grimes caring enough about the outcome to make a call in the first place. You can't have Andrea putting down the knife without also having Andrea be someone who wanted, genuinely, to believe in the possibility of peace. The same qualities that produced the errors produced the things we loved about these characters. There's a version of this video where you could make the opposite argument, where you take every decision we've talked about tonight and reframe it as correct, or at least defensible. Rick's secrecy was protective, Laurie's independence was principled, Shane's aggression was clear-eyed, Andrea's mercy was human. That version of the argument has merit. Part of what makes The Walking Dead compelling, across all its seasons, is that it's generally quite honest about the cost of both options. The cost of being hard and the cost of being soft, and the way those costs land on the people around you rather than just on yourself. What the show kept finding season after season is that there's no decision that doesn't have a consequence, and no consequence that only touches the person who made the choice. The ripple effects are everything. Rick's decision not to tell the group about Jenna's secret shapes how they handle death for a season. Carol's decision to kill Karen and David shapes the community for months. The scavengers' betrayal shapes the war. Every choice is downstream of something and upstream of something else, and the full picture is always larger than any single person can see. That's rather what makes it interesting to revisit. At whatever hour you happen to be watching this, there's something quietly absorbing about running through it all. The horse, the barn, the knife, the dumpster, the bridge, and recognizing that 11 seasons of television were held together, fundamentally, by the question of how people treat each other when the world stops doing it for them. There's something about the sheer quantity of it, across all those episodes and all those years, that ends up feeling almost comforting at this sort of hour. Everyone is doing their best. Their best is frequently not good enough. They get up the next morning and try again. Most of them, the ones who survive long enough, get better. Carol gets better. Daryl gets better. Even Gabriel gets better, eventually. The mistakes are not the last word on any of them. The show has spin-offs too, if you're interested in more. Daryl's in France. Maggie and Negan are in New York. Rick and Michonne had their own series. Each of those has its own particular catalogue of interesting decisions, and I'd love to spend some time with them in future videos. For now though, this feels like a good place to wind down. 11 seasons. Sophia in the barn, Andrea and the knife, Spencer's chess game, the horse, always the horse. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.